Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week we return to the Pentamerone. 2 stories this time. The first one's got quite a bit of folklore to discuss, the second one not so much. Thanks again to the production team from LibriVox and to Joy Chen for the reading.
Chapter 29. Sun, Moon, and Talia. It is a well-known fact that the cruel man is generally his own hangman, and he who throws stones at heaven frequently comes off with a broken head. But the reverse of the medal shows us that innocence is a shield of fig-tree wood, upon which the sword of malice is broken, or blunts its point, so that, when a poor man fancies himself already dead and buried, he revives again in bone and flesh, as you shall hear in the story which I am going to draw from the cask of memory with the tap of my tongue. There was once a great lord, who, having a daughter born to him named Talia, commanded the seers and wise men of his kingdom to come and tell him her fortune. And after various counsellings they came to the conclusion that a great peril awaited her from a piece of stalk in some flax. Thereupon he issued a command prohibiting any flax or hemp or such like thing to be brought into his house, hoping thus to avoid the danger. When Talia was grown up and was standing one day at the window, she saw an old woman pass by who was spinning. She had never seen a distaff or a spindle, and being vastly pleased with the twisting and twirling of the thread, her curiosity was so great that she made the old woman come upstairs. Then, taking the distaff in her hand, Talia began to draw out the thread, when, by mischance, a piece of stalk in the flax getting under her fingernail, she fell dead upon the ground. At which sight the old woman hobbled downstairs as quickly as she could. When the unhappy father heard of the disaster that had befallen Talia, after weeping bitterly, he placed her in that palace in the country, upon a velvet seat under a canopy of brocade. And fastening the doors, he quitted for ever the place which had been the cause of such misfortune to him, in order to drive all remembrance of it from his mind. Now a certain king happened to go one day to the chase, and a falcon escaping from him flew in at the window of that palace. When the king found that the bird did not return at his call, he ordered his attendants to knock at the door, thinking that the place was inhabited. And after knocking for some time, the king ordered them to fetch a vine-dresser's ladder, wishing himself to scale the house and see what was inside. Then he mounted the ladder, and going through the whole palace, he stood aghast at not finding there any living person. At last he came to the room where Talia was lying, as if enchanted, and when the king saw her, he called to her, thinking that she was asleep. But in vain, for she still slept on, however loud he called. So, after admiring her beauty a while, the king returned home to his kingdom, where for a long time he forgot all that had happened.
So, in the original, he carries her to a bed and picks the fruits of love, then leaves her there and forgets all about her for a long time. Apparently, this is the hero of the story. Let's see the Victorian author try and tidy this up.
Meanwhile 2 little twins, one a boy and the other a girl, who looked like 2 little jewels, wandered, from I know not where, into the palace, and found Talia in a trance. At first they were afraid, because they tried in vain to awaken her. But becoming bolder, the girl gently took Talia's finger into her mouth, to bite it and wake her up by this means. And so it happened that the splinter of flax came out.
In the original, she gives birth to twins after 9 months, and 2 fairies appear to nurse them and put them to their mother's breasts. The girl detaches, and when she's trying to reattach, she sucks on her mother's finger, drawing out the piece of linen.
Thereupon she seemed to awake as from a deep sleep, and when she saw those little jewels at her side, she took them to her heart, and loved them more than her life. But she wondered greatly at seeing herself quite alone in the palace with 2 children, and food and refreshment brought her by unseen hands.
In the Italian, she doesn't take them to her heart, she takes them to her breast. She knows she's their mother because her milk has come down. She's still amazed by the whole business, though.
After a time the king, calling Talia to mind, took occasion one day when he went to the chase to go and see her. And when he found her awakened, and with 2 beautiful little creatures by her side, he was struck dumb with rapture. Then the king told Talia who he was, and they formed a great league and friendship, and he remained there for several days, promising as he took leave to return and fetch her. When the king went back to his own kingdom, he was for ever repeating the names of Talia and the little ones, insomuch that when he was eating he had Talia in his mouth, and Sun and Moon, for so he named the children. Nay, even when he went to rest he did not leave off calling on them, first one and then the other. Now the king's stepmother had grown suspicious at his long absence at the chase.
In the Penguin edition, obviously it's not his stepmother, it's his wife.
And when she heard him calling thus on Talia, Sun, and Moon, she waxed wroth and said to the king's secretary, "Hark ye, friend, you stand in great danger between the axe and the block. Tell me who it is that my stepson is enamoured of, and I will make you rich. But if you conceal the truth from me, I'll make you rue it."
She's a bit more classically educated in the Italian. The boy is between Scylla and Charybdis. Her threat is, "I'll make sure you're found neither dead nor alive," which is terrifying in an area which has the Arch Necromantrix's people in it.
The man, moved on the one side by fear, and on the other pricked by interest, which is a bandage to the eyes of honour, the blind of justice, and an old horseshoe to trip up good faith, told the queen the whole truth, whereupon she sent the secretary in the king's name to Talia, saying that he wished to see the children. Then Talia sent them with great joy, but the queen commanded the cook to kill them, and serve them up in various ways for her wretched stepson to eat.
The Penguin edition calls the queen a Heart of Medea, which is a reference to Medea murdering her children so that Jason can't take them away. I admit to not knowing that tale very well. I've only seen it presented once, and they were trying very hard to convince me that Medea was the heroine and that her murdering her children in a custody dispute was a proto-feminist act. I don't think I'm sold on that idea. Making them into something to eat parallels a story in the Gesta Romanorum, which Shakespeare probably used as a source for a similar scene in Titus Andronicus.
Now the cook, who had a tender heart, seeing the two pretty little golden pippins,
A pippin is an apple.
took compassion on them, and gave them to his wife, bidding her keep them concealed. Then he killed and dressed 2 little kids in 100 different ways.
Specifically kid goats in the Penguin edition. Kid to refer to human children first occurs in English in the 1590s.
When the king came, the queen quickly ordered the dishes served up, and the king fell to eating with great delight, exclaiming, "How good this is! Oh, how excellent! By the soul of my grandfather!" And the old queen all the while kept saying, "Eat away, for you know what you eat." At first the king paid no attention to what she said, but at last, hearing the music continue, he replied, "Ay, I know well enough what I eat, for you brought nothing to the house." And at last, getting up in a rage, he went off to a villa at a little distance to cool his anger.
The Penguin edition makes the nature of this argument rather clearer. Eat up, for you are eating what is yours. And then he responds, "I know it is mine because you did not bring a thing with you into this house," referring to a dowry.
Meanwhile the queen, not satisfied with what she had done, called the secretary again, and sent him to fetch Talia, pretending that the king wished to see her. At this summons Talia went that very instant, longing to see the light of her eyes, and not knowing that only the smoke awaited her. But when she came before the queen, the latter said to her, with the face of a Nero, and full of poison as a viper, "Welcome, Madam Sly-cheat. Are you indeed the pretty mischief-maker? Are you the weed that has caught my son's eye and given me all this trouble?"
Longing to see the light of her eyes and not knowing that only smoke awaited her seems to be an odd translation here. The Penguin translation says, wishing to see her light when only fire awaited her. The Queen then calls her a sly-cheat. That's a Victorian way to avoid saying something that you wouldn't want to put into a children's book by adding an extra syllable. The swear words in the original are much more direct because Italian nobles liked swearing, and Italian children didn't think some of our modern swears were all that bad because their swear words tended to focus on the divine rather than scatological references.
When Talia heard this, she began to excuse herself, but the queen would not listen to a word.
In the Penguin edition, she says her territory was taken possession of while under a sleeping spell. Here, a better story would have been the Queen and Talia teaming up to torture the king, who clearly deserves it, but sadly that's not the story we have. It is merely the one I want. You'll notice that the author himself has ceased referring to the Queen as the mother-in-law. She is the Queen, she is the wife of the king.
And having a large fire lighted in the courtyard, she commanded that Talia should be thrown into the flames. Poor Talia, seeing matters come to a bad pass, fell on her knees before the Queen, and besought her at least to grant her time to take the clothes from off her back. Whereupon the Queen, not so much out of pity for the unhappy girl as to get possession of her dress, which was embroidered all over with gold and pearls, said to her, "Undress yourself, I allow you." Then Talia began to undress, and as she took off each garment she uttered an exclamation of grief. And when she had stripped off her cloak, her gown, and her jacket, and was proceeding to take off her petticoat, they seized her and were dragging her away.
In the Penguin edition, she gives a last shriek, saying that they are about to supply the ashes for the laundry tub in which Charon washes his breeches. I've always thought of Charon as more of a robe man myself. He's the ferryman of the dead. Breeches stop just below the knee, so that's a look for a skeletal chap. Then again, the skeletal thing is a newer convention so far as I can tell. In ancient authors, he's a greasy, beardy fellow who doesn't seem to do his laundry.
At that moment the king came up, and seeing the spectacle he demanded to know the whole truth. And when he asked also for the children, and heard that his stepmother had ordered them to be killed, the unhappy king gave himself up to despair.
He calls himself a werewolf to his children, who were lambs in the Penguin edition. He also damns himself as compost for broccoli, which I think is funny.
He then ordered her to be thrown into the same fire which had been lighted for Talia, and the secretary with her, who was the handle of this cruel game and the weaver of this wicked web. Then he was going to do the same with the cook, thinking that he had killed the children. But the cook threw himself at the king's feet and said, "Truly, Sir King, I would desire no other sinecure in return for the service I had done you than to be thrown into a furnace full of live coals. I would ask no other gratuity than the thrust of a spike. I would wish for no other amusement than to be roasted in the fire. I would desire no other privilege than to have the ashes of the cook mingled with those of a queen. But I look for no such great reward for having saved the children and brought them back to you in spite of that wicked creature who wished to kill them."
In the Penguin edition, he doesn't do the sarcastic tone, he just begs. Also, the spike enters a particular and tender part of his anatomy.
When the king heard these words, he was quite beside himself. He appeared to dream and could not believe what his ears had heard. Then he said to the cook, "If it is true that you have saved the children, be assured I will take you from turning the spit, and reward you so that you shall call yourself the happiest man in the world." As the king was speaking these words, the wife of the cook, seeing the dilemma her husband was in, brought Sun and Moon before the king, who, playing at the game of three with Talia and the other children, went round and round kissing first one and then another. Then giving the cook a large reward, he made him his chamberlain, and he took Talia to wife, who enjoyed a long life with her husband and the children, acknowledging that he who has luck may go to bed, and bliss will reign upon his head. Chapter 30. Nannillo and Nannella. Woe to him who thinks to find a governess for his children by giving them a stepmother. He only brings into his house the cause of their ruin. There never yet was a stepmother who looked kindly on the children of another. Or if by chance such a one were ever found, she would be regarded as a miracle, and be called a white crow. But beside all those of whom you may have heard, I will now tell you of another, to be added to the list of heartless stepmothers, whom you will consider well deserving the punishment she purchased for herself with ready money. There was once a good man named Jannuccio, who had 2 children, Nannillo and Nannella, whom he loved as much as his own life. But death having, with the smooth file of time, severed the prison bars of his wife's soul, he took to himself a cruel woman, who had no sooner set foot in his house than she began to ride the high horse, saying, "Am I come here indeed to look after other folks' children? A pretty job I have undertaken, to have all this trouble, and be for ever teased by a couple of squalling brats. Would that I had broken my neck ere I ever came to this place, to have bad food, worse drink, and get no sleep at night. Here's a life to lead. Forsooth I came as a wife, and not as a servant. But I must find some means of getting rid of these creatures, or it will cost me my life. Better to blush once than to grow pale 100 times. So I've done with them, for I am resolved to send them away, or to leave the house myself for ever." The poor husband, who had some affection for this woman, said to her, "Softly, wife, don't be angry, for sugar is dear, and tomorrow morning before the cock crows I will remove this annoyance in order to please you." So the next morning, ere the dawn had hung out the red counterpane at the window of the east to air it, Jannuccio took the children, one by each hand, and with a good basketful of things to eat upon his arm, he led them to a wood, where an army of poplars and beech trees were holding the shades besieged. Then Jannuccio said, "My little children, stay here in this wood, and eat and drink merrily. But if you want anything, follow this line of ashes which I have been strewing as we came along. This will be a clue to lead you out of the labyrinth and bring you straight home." Then giving them both a kiss, he returned weeping to his house. But at the hour when all creatures, summoned by the constables of night, pay to nature the tax of needful repose, the two children began to feel afraid at remaining in that lonesome place, where the waters of a river, which was thrashing the impertinent stones were obstructing its course, would have frightened even a hero. So they went slowly along the path of ashes, and it was already midnight ere they reached their home. When Pascozza, their stepmother, saw the children, she acted not like a woman, but a perfect fury. Crying aloud, wringing her hands, stamping with her feet, snorting like a frightened horse, and exclaiming, "What fine piece of work is this? Is there no way of ridding the house of these creatures? Is it possible, husband, that you are determined to keep them here to plague my very life out? Go, take them out of my sight. I'll not wait for the crowing of cocks and the cackling of hens, or else be assured that tomorrow morning I'll go off to my parents' house, for you do not deserve me. I have not brought you so many fine things, only to be made the slave of children who are not my own." Poor Jannuccio, who saw that matters were growing rather too warm, immediately took the little ones and returned to the wood, where giving the children another basketful of food, he said to them, "You see, my dears, how this wife of mine, who has come to my house to be your ruin and a nail in my heart, hates you. Therefore remain in this wood, where the trees, more compassionate, will give you shelter from the sun, where the river, more charitable, will give you drink without poison, and the earth, more kind, will give you a pillow of grass without danger. And when you want food, follow this little path of bran which I have made for you in a straight line, and you can come and seek what you require." So saying, he turned away his face, not to let himself be seen to weep and dishearten the poor little creatures. When Nannillo and Nannella had eaten all that was in the basket, they wanted to return home. But alas, a jackass, the son of ill luck, had eaten up all the bran that was strewn upon the ground. So they lost their way, and wandered about forlorn in the wood for several days, feeding on acorns and chestnuts which they found fallen on the ground. But as heaven always extends its arm over the innocent, there came by chance a prince to hunt in that wood. Then Nannillo, hearing the baying of the hounds, was so frightened that he crept into a hollow tree, and Nannella set off running at full speed, and ran until she came out of the wood, and found herself on the seashore. Now it happened that some pirates who had landed there to get fuel saw Nannella and carried her off, and their captain took her home with him, where he and his wife, having just lost a little girl, took her as their daughter. Meanwhile Nannillo, who had hidden himself in the tree, was surrounded by the dogs, which made such a furious barking that the prince sent to find out the cause. And when he discovered the pretty little boy, who was so young that he could not tell who were his father and mother, he ordered one of the huntsmen to set him upon his saddle and take him to the royal palace. Then he had him brought up with great care, and instructed in various arts, and among others he had him taught that of a carver, so that before 3 or 4 years had passed, Nennillo became so expert in his art that he could carve a joint to a hair.
Allow me to clarify that a carver, in this case, is a meat carver, not a wood carver. A meat carver is a table servant. In the Tudor period, meat carving becomes particularly important because the importation and use of sugar has made teeth so bad that the upper classes think it fashionable, at times, to paint them black to honour the Queen.
Now about this time it was discovered that the captain of the ship who had taken Nennella to his house was a sea-robber, and the people wished to take him prisoner. But getting timely notice from the clerks in the law courts who were his friends, and whom he kept in his pay, he fled with all his family. It was decreed, however, perhaps by the judgment of heaven, that he who had committed his crimes upon the sea should suffer the punishment of them. For having embarked in a small boat, no sooner was he upon the open sea than there came such a storm of wild and tumult of the waves, that the boat was upset, and all were drowned, all except Nennella, who, having had no share in the corsair's robberies, like his wife and children, escaped the danger. For just then a large enchanted fish, which was swimming about the boat, opened its huge throat and swallowed her down.
She's being spirited away into a Reggio.
The little girl now thought to herself that her days were surely at an end, when suddenly she found a thing to amaze her inside the fish. Beautiful fields and fine gardens, and a splendid mansion, with all that heart could desire, in which she lived like a princess. Then she was carried quickly by the fish to a rock, where it chanced that the prince had come to escape the burning heat of a summer, and to enjoy the cool sea breezes. And whilst a great banquet was preparing, Nennillo had stepped out upon a balcony of the palace on the rock to sharpen some knives, priding himself greatly on acquiring honour from his office. When Nennella saw him through the fish's throat, she cried aloud, "Brother, brother, your task is done, the tables are laid out every one, but here in the fish I must sit and sigh. O brother, without you I soon shall die." Nennillo at first paid no attention to the voice, but the prince, who was standing on another balcony and had also heard it, turned in the direction whence the sound came, and saw the fish. And when he again heard the same words, he was beside himself with amazement, and ordered a number of servants to try whether by any means they could ensnare the fish and draw it to land. At last, hearing the words "Brother, brother," continually repeated, he asked all his servants, one by one, whether any of them had lost a sister. And Nennillo replied that he recollected, as a dream, having had a sister when the prince found him in the wood, but that he had never since heard any tidings of her. Then the prince told him to go nearer to the fish and see what was the matter, for perhaps this adventure might concern him. As soon as Nennillo approached the fish, it raised up its head upon the rock, and opening its throat 6 palms wide, Nennella stepped out, so beautiful that she looked just like a nymph in some interlude, come forth from that animal at the incantation of a magician. And when the prince asked her how it had all happened, she told him a part of her sad story, and the hatred of their stepmother. But not being able to recollect the name of their father, nor of their home, the prince caused a proclamation to be issued, commanding that whoever had lost 2 children, named Nennillo and Nennella, in a wood, should come to the royal palace, and he would there receive joyful news of them. Jannuccio, who had all this time passed a sad and disconsolate life, believing that his children had been devoured by wolves, now hastened with greatest joy to seek the prince, and told him that he had lost the children. And when he had related the story, how he had been compelled to take them to the wood, the prince gave him a good scolding, calling him a blockhead for allowing a woman to put her heel upon his neck, till he was brought to send away 2 such jewels as his children. But after he had broken Jannuccio's head with these words, he applied to it the plaster of consolation, showing him the children, whom the father embraced and kissed for half an hour without being satisfied. Then the prince made him pull off his jacket, and had him dressed like a lord, and sending for Jannuccio's wife, he showed her those 2 golden pippins, asked her what that person would deserve who should do them any harm, and even endanger their lives. And she replied, For my part, I would put her into a closed cask and send her rolling down a mountain.
The step that has been skipped by the Victorian author is that the cask that you put the person into before you roll them down the mountain has nails driven through the outside so that there are sharp metal points within.
So it shall be done, said the prince. The goat has butted at herself. Quick now, you have passed the sentence, and you must suffer it, for having borne these beautiful stepchildren such malice. So he gave orders that the sentence should be instantly executed. Then choosing a very rich lord among his vassals, he gave him Nennella to wife, and the daughter of another great lord to Nennillo, allowing them enough to live upon with their father, so that they wanted for nothing in the world.
Notice that the king doesn't marry her himself. This makes him substantially better than the vast majority of kings that we've run across in these stories.
But the stepmother, shut into the cask and shut out from life, kept on crying through the bunghole as long as she had breath. To him who mischief seeks shall mischief fall. There comes an hour that recompenses all.
That brings us to the end of the main sequence of the Pentamerone. There are 4 more stories in the Victorian edition that I didn't include, 3 because I couldn't see anything that was role-playing related in them, and 1 because the racism in it is a direct parallel to the racism in the frame story. It's how the frame story pays off. The current plan is to put the 3 stories, which have some interest, onto Games from Folktales as a bonus episode, and then I will start working through the stories which the Victorian author extracted from the Tale of Tales, generally because they contain folklore that makes them particularly suitable for role-playing games. Your saga may vary.